Tsarism ability to survive 1906 to 1914. Concessions. The October Manifesto was a statement that outlined a constitution that would set up an elected parliament, also known as a Duma, and guarantee freedom of speech and religion. It was issued by Nicholas II under pressure during the unrest of 1905. This appealed to the middle classes. The Liberals saw it as a step towards democracy, but the Tsar wanted to restrict its implementation. The fundamental laws of 1906 made clear the Tsar's determination to maintain autocracy. The Tsar also cancelled redemption payments under Stolypin's land reforms to reduce unrest among the peasantry. It was proven successful, but only for a short period of time. However, once the Tsar felt confident enough, he went back on some of these concessions. He did this with the fundamental laws, which allowed him to rule by decree when the Duma was not in session. The changes to the electoral system in 1907 gave the nobility greater influence in the Duma than other groups, which also allowed the State Council to stop laws passed by the Duma. Newspapers needed a license to operate and could be shut down if critical to the regime. Also, public meetings needed police approval and a 72-hour notice. The Tsar was unwilling to tolerate extreme Dumas. The first two Dumas were considered too extreme and were dissolved by Nicholas. The third Duma only lasted longer because it was more moderate, following the 1907 electoral change, and because Stolypin was willing to work with it. Even then, the government sometimes bypassed the Duma and ruled by decree. Repression. Stolypin brought in court-martials, which were called field courts for civilians, that executed peasants that had been accused of riot and rebellion. 1,114 were executed from 1906 to 1907, and a further 5,000 by 1909, with thousands more being exiled to Siberia. This became known as Stolypin's necktie. Revolutionary groups were crushed, such as the Petrograd Soviets, and revolutionaries were jailed or forced to flee. Lenin fled, but Trotsky was jailed. Loyal troops returned home from the Russo-Japanese War to put down any workers' disturbances, most notably the Lenin Goldfields massacre, where the army shot 170 workers dead after a protest at the Lenin Goldfields. The Tsar used the secret police, the Okhrana, to put down any disturbances that were arising in Petrograd. Reforms. Land reforms in Stolypin. Stolypin's land reforms had two aims. Political aim: to create a class of better off peasants who would have an interest in being loyal to the Tsarist regime. Economic aim: to increase agricultural productivity. Stolypin believed that it would take 20 years before the full effects of his agricultural reforms would be seen. In the current situation, the reforms only had 8 years before the outbreak of World War I. Peasants were given financial help through the setting up of a peasant bank to leave the commune, also known as the Mir, and buy their own farms. State land was made available for peasants to purchase in which to have their own farms. Peasants were encouraged to move east to Siberia, where there was fertile land for farming. Peasants were encouraged to move away from strip farming towards consolidated farms to increase the agricultural productivity. The hated land captains were abolished, which pleased the peasants, and so was the passport system that restricted peasant movement, which made peasants more free to travel and relocate. Redemption payments were later cancelled, which really pleased the peasants. Industrial reform. Industrial growth rate was around about 6% each year, with heavy industry doing well, which in turn led to foreign trade to increase. Trade unions were made illegal in order to push the workers. This growth was made by heavy taxation on the peasantry and a large amount of foreign loans. But Russia still seemed to lag behind industry compared to the rest of Europe. Working conditions began to become more suitable for the workers, but at the same time went on, and the number of workers increased. They began to worsen. Living and working conditions still remained poor, and even before the trade unions were made illegal, they still had little influence. Strikes were a lot low at the beginning, but as time progressed, so did the numbers of strikes, from 47,000 in 1910 to 1,377,000 in 1914. Education reform. The number of pupils in primary education doubled between 1904 and 1914. Those in secondary education quadrupled, and the number of students in higher education tripled in the same period. These figures indicated progress, but the reforms were criticised as being too little too late. Education also made it easier to spread revolutionary ideas to an already discontent people. Weaknesses of opposition. In 1905, opponents to Tsarism lacked unity because they all wanted different economic and political change. The middle classes wanted more political say. Peasants were concerned about poor harvests and paying redemption dues. The working classes were angry at inflation, unemployment, and their working and living conditions. Revolutionary groups such as the Social Revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, and Bolsheviks played little part in the events of 1905. Between 1906 and 1914, opponents to Tsarism were divided on strategy, which was useful to the Tsar. The liberals, also known as the middle classes, wanted reform but not revolution, but they were divided between the Octoberists and the Cadets. The Octoberists were happy with the October Manifesto, but the Cadets saw it as the first step to further political reform. They were both worried about the amount of working class and peasant disturbances in 1905, so they were willing to work with the Tsar as long as he brought in reforms. The revolutionary groups wanted rid of Tsarism as a total, but they were too divided on strategy. The Social Revolutionaries looked for a peasant-led revolution. The Social Democrats were split in two, into the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, but they both looked for a proletarian middle-class-led revolution, but they too were further divided on strategy. The Mensheviks did not believe a proletarian revolution was imminent, and sought to work out with other groups such as trade unions to educate the workers and improve working class conditions. The Bolsheviks were a smaller, close-knit professional group. They did not believe in working with others and wanted economic conditions to worsen, as this would increase working class anger. Other factors. After 1905 there was a rise in luck for the Tsar as there was good harvest and economic recovery and stability, but only up to 1912. These good harvests meant that the reason for discontent in 1905 fell. The Tsar was able to keep the loyalty of key groups. The army, after returning from the Russo-Japanese War, were loyal to Tsarism and put down disturbances under his orders. The Tsar was also able to keep the loyalty of the nobility, the bureaucracy, and the church, giving him support he needed to survive.